So, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests and associates, welcome to the 9th Delphi Economic Forum. My name is Katsikidis Athanasios. I'm a freelance columnist at Kathimerini newspaper. I'm delighted to moderate this intrigued discussion titled Navigating the Storm, Crisis Leadership on a Complex World. Let me introduce today's guest. On my right, Mr. Andy Coulson. Mr. Coulson was the editor of the News of the World newspaper from 2003 to 2007, before serving as the Downing Street Director of Communication during David Cameron's tenure. Nowadays, Mr. Coulson is the CEO of Coulson Partners and also the host of Crisis What Crisis podcast. Mr. Coulson, welcome.
Good morning.
Mr. Coulson, let's start our discussion with a brief definition of the word leadership. If I may provide our audience with a definition of leadership, for my experience, leadership is the art of inspiring individuals to explore their full capabilities, cope with difficulties, challenge their limits, and maximize success in the unforeseeable task or mission. A leader is a person who makes tough decisions without considering the personal cost, but only the public good. Moving to the core of our today's discussion, the first section is the US elections on November 5th. On November 5th, the American citizens would decide whether to choose the introvert Biden or the extrovert Trump. For many, Biden is physically unable, and for others, mentally unstable to continue leading the country. On the other hand, Trump looks to be the greatest fear for NATO's coherence and peripheral stability. With the revival of populism in the United States and the Euro-disruptive powers leading some of the European states, the November 5th elections will be decisive for the next day of the European continent. Mr. Coulson, for many, the United States lacks of professional and competent leadership. The same maverick politicians are running the most powerful country in the world, while the young politician seems not wanting to lead the country. So my question is that, is the United States experiencing the greatest crisis of finding competent leaders in several decades?
There's a lot to unpack there,
yeah.
Athanasios. I think the fact that we are heading to a US election with two candidates who are older than President Clinton suggests that maybe there is, a bit of a blockage in the leadership pipeline, if I can put it that way. And it's going to be very interesting to see, given that I think for a lot of Americans this is a choice between, the least worst option, if you like, what impact that will have on turnout, for example. Biden got a record number of votes in 2020. Will he again this time, or will either candidate again this time? I think it'll be interesting to see. But, this leadership issue is not restricted to the US. I'm from the UK, where we, change our prime ministers more often than we change our shirts, frankly, in recent times. And, of course, that's true across a number of other nations as well. There's a real leadership vacuum. And if you ask the question, why is that? I quite like the 4 I's, as in the letter I model. The first I being inflation. People don't like rising costs. They don't much like the solution to rising costs either, which is, higher interest rates. Immigration is the second I, an issue that tends to drag electorates towards a certain type of party, a certain type of politics. Illegal immigration, of course, has also got that extra layer of emotion that can drag a country, an electorate, in a particular direction, even if the voters themselves aren't necessarily, or don't see themselves as on the right. The third I think, is inequality, the general sense that people feel that there's a small number of people who are moving forward while the rest are left behind. And then the fourth I is incumbency. The idea that the longer you stay in power, either as an individual or as a party, the less popular you become. This is what political scientists call the sort of cost of ruling. And we've seen a lot of parties, actually, across the world, and individuals in some cases, there are a few exceptions, that have been around for a very long time. Japan, Britain, the Conservatives, France, a number of other places. And I think that is also, a factor. But all of this creates, I think, a sort of atmosphere that lends to a certain type of leader. And if what we're trying to achieve here is to find and encourage potential leaders who are, sane, sensible, able, not narcissistic, which doesn't seem to be, to me, an awful lot to ask, then this atmosphere that's being created doesn't lend itself. And so, and that's not just the politician's fault. I think we've got to ask ourselves that question as well. I used to be in the media. I was a newspaper editor. I spent plenty of time kind of fueling the flames of that more extreme atmosphere, if you like. And I think we all do. Social media, right? I mean, voters are diving in on this stuff as well. So I think there's a need for us to, if we want a different type of leader, then every part of the machinery has got to change.
Yeah. Based on your extensive experience, do you foresee Donald Trump's great comeback? And if so, what strategies should his campaign managers adopt and follow?
Well, I think actually it's probably more his lawyer's strategy that is key at the moment. I think it seems pretty clear that Donald Trump is on a race against time. Is he going to be able to stay out of court in some fairly serious situations, before he gets the chance to see whether or not people want him to be president? His campaign, if he manages to stay ahead of that, and if he doesn't, by the way, I think that although the polling is very good for him at the moment, in some of those really crucial seats, if he does end up in court, I think that's going to be very difficult for him with those small number of voters who really matter. But if he does manage to do that, then I think the Trump campaign is very straightforward. He's already playing it out and it's working very nicely for him. The more interesting point really is what's the Biden campaign? How does he address the issue of his apparent frailty? How does he start to take responsibility, or not responsibility, credit, I should say, actually, for the economy, interest rates, or inflation aside, I should say. And that all, I think, sort of causes you to sort of pull back and ask the sort of bigger question of how is it that America is in this situation where, as I say, the vast majority of voters, I think, are going to be making a decision based on the least worst option.
Yeah, I see. Two more arenas of conflict are Israel versus Hamas and the war in Ukraine. Netanyahu, the most well-known and for many gifted politician of 21st century in Israel, is experiencing this catastrophic and probably irreversible impact on his image. On the one hand, Israel experienced the worst deadly terrorist attack in its recent history, while in Israel's attempt to eradicate Hamas and retaliate, thousands of Palestinian Arabs are falling dead. Mr. Coulson, how is to be a leader amidst a crisis, in Israel's case a war, and what is the role of an effective staff?
The question around leadership in crisis is something that we talk about a lot actually on the podcast. It's, I've talked to politicians and I've also talked to people who've kind of been in crisis of very different types, terror included as well as conflict. And, over those, more than 100 conversations that I've had, there are some commonalities in terms of the type of leadership that's required in crisis. And I would boil it down to sort of three things, really. There's four, but the first three is the ability, obviously, to stay strategic, is to fix on the long term and stay fixed on the long term. The second is to understand what you have control of and what you don't have control of. which is essentially Stoicism. So we have the Greeks to thank for that. And then the third point is resilience. You know, the ability to absorb criticism, however personal, however difficult, however destabilizing, and to stay on course. And if we look at the Middle East right now, it is, you know, obviously terrifying and depressing in equal measure, but it is also, from a leadership point of view, quite fascinating, I think, because if we look at Netanyahu, if we look at Bibi, you know, a six-term leader, and if I apply that leadership model to him, has he stayed strategic? Well, one might argue that he has, right? Has he focused on what he's got control of? Well, one might argue that as long as he's got a flow of arms and control of those arms, then yes, he has. And in terms of resilience, whatever you think of him, it's undeniable as a six-term leader that he has personal resilience. But you know, there's something else that comes out of the conversations that I've had on the podcast, and that is that there's a fourth key attribute, and that attribute is the ability to put courage to work. That's not just personal courage, that's being able to put it to work. And, you know, in some of those conversations that I've had, including people who've faced the most extreme crisis, what they say is that, you know, fear obviously is, and anger are very contagious. But, you know, courage is also incredibly contagious. And so one might argue that, you know, the courageous thing now, have we seen courage from Bibi? And one might argue that actually what will manifest as courage for him is the ability to not just be led by the more extreme elements of his coalition, to be able to pull back, to be able to focus on the possibility of a two-state solution, to be able to kind of normalize with Saudi Arabia, which is the grand prize, you know, in this terrible situation. But there's no sign, obviously, of that happening. And I should also say, by the way, that I'm sat here speaking as someone who has not been directly affected by, you know, the events of last October or Gaza. And so, you know, everything I've just said should be filed under, you know, easy to say, much harder to do.
Yeah, I agree. Moving to the last section, the war in Ukraine. 2 years since the invasion of Ukraine by the Russian forces, and the leadership of the two countries seem more determined to continue the war than to retreat. Speaking of the war, the war in Ukraine shattered Europe's stability and cohesion. In your view, why did the European leadership seem so weak in the face of the Russian forces? And why to this day the European leaders are divided on whether to send military aid such as troops to Ukraine?
Well, I think this issue actually goes beyond political leadership. You know, if you look at what has happened with the Ukrainian situation, it is obviously a political failure, but it is also a failure of those who are tasked with, you know, analysing, predicting to a degree, certainly protecting us from, you know, potential existential threats. And I speak from a UK perspective. Those responsible for that failed, right? There's no doubt about that. But it was also a failure in the analysis of Putin, who he is, what mattered to him. Did the mainstream, you know, European view actually matter to him? It turns out it didn't at all. And also a kind of, you know, that dependency point, right? About, you know, what do we need from Russia? And also, over a longer period of time, you know, a willingness to see the upside of Russia, commercial upside of Russia, without really looking at the downside. But I think there's another point as well. And I think that this talks to a deeper malaise that we have, not just in the UK, but I think across Europe as well. And that is that leaders are too inclined, possibly because of that atmosphere that I've mentioned, to look inward and to consider the domestic issues. And, you know, how do you start to, if we go back, you know, where do you start the clock, but how do you start to predict an event like Ukraine when you're spending so much of your time as a leader worrying about the latest row that's broken on Twitter or X or whatever it's called today. And also I think COVID was an issue, right? And I think we've got to be fair on that, right? Every nation in the world was trying to wrestle with something that was unexpected and existential. And so the eye was taken off the ball. And I think certainly in Downing Street, where I used to work, you know, had someone walked into the room in the middle of that and said, oh, Prime Minister, I think it's time to spend, a day on the Putin problem, I think you would have probably been sent out of the room.
Okay.
And that's a difficulty with the day-to-day operational reality of politics.
I see. What steps should the European leaders follow to foster Europe's cohesion and common actions/policies?
Well, I think events like this are a great start. Let's start walking towards some of these difficult questions rather than away from them. I think that's a great demonstration of the importance of an event like the Delphi Forum. But I think the other thing we need are leaders who are able to join the dots between what seem to be, for a lot of people, very remote problems, and join the dots to their own lives, right? To make it real for people, not in a patronizing way, but in a helpful way. And I think actually, if I were to use Brexit as an example, that's where the Remain campaign failed, right? We didn't make Europe, and the argument around Europe kind of work. It didn't fit with people's lives enough. The dots weren't joined. And then the final thing I'd say is a greater reliance on experience. I've done a lot of interviews on the pod with people who are either leaving politics or have left politics. And the conversation that you have with people at that stage in their life is so interesting. And you can't help but say to yourself, why didn't you talk like that when you were in office? Right? Why didn't we behave like that when you were doing the job? We would have made so much more progress. But obviously that's the system we have.
In conclusion, and having mentioned aspects of effective and ineffective leadership in the midst of crisis, Mr. Coulson, based on what we discussed, what kind of leaders and leadership do we need in the modern era?
Well, yesterday I took a walk down the hill and went to the amazing,
Mantillo.
Yes, indeed, the Temple of Apollo. I touched on Stoicism earlier. I'm a bit of a fan of the Stoics. And there is definitely a leadership lesson from the Stoics. In fact, there's a leadership lesson from the founder of the Stoics, right, Zeno of Citium. Because when he created that movement, if you like, he sat around, with his special advisors, and they had a discussion about what should the brand be, right? What should this movement be called? And one of those special advisors, who was obviously someone who knew how to manage up, if I can put it that way, said to him, well, let's call it Zenonism. And that's what they did for a little while, until Zeno decided further down the track, you know what, we're going to U-turn. We're going to change our minds, which is quite unusual for a leader, and we're going to call it Stoicism. And that he did that because he wanted to avoid the creation of a personality cult. And I think there's a little lesson there, right? Because if we have more leaders who take that kind of view, then maybe we'll end up with more leaders who don't really see the world through the prism of themselves. We have a few less people who just consider it to be all about them. And there is a second point, because you mentioned teams earlier. That person in that conversation was able to get it wrong. I think it's critical that leaders create environments where their advisors, as I used to be, and I am now in a very different context, in my business, where people have the room to be able to get it wrong. When I started working for David Cameron, I made him 3 promises. I said, and they're the same 3 promises that I now say to my clients, that I'll always be available, particularly in the difficult moments, that I'll always have a view. And you might say, well, that's obvious if you're going to be an advisor, but the world is full of advisors, and in my view, lawyers who don't have views. And the third thing is that I'll be right more than I'm wrong. Okay. So I give myself permission to be wrong. The important thing is I'm right more than I'm wrong. But you've got to allow people to make mistakes.
So we have 30 seconds. Do we need good leaders or effective teams?
We need both. They're 2 sides of the same coin. A leader's responsibility is to look outward to the public, to the people that they serve, and to ensure that they are listening and that they are, effective. But they also need to look inwards to the people who are going to help them deliver that. And they do that by selecting the right people, making sure you've got the right people in the room, but then creating an atmosphere that will allow people to say what you need to hear, not what you want to hear, and to get things wrong.
Mr. Coulson, thank you very much for joining this discussion.
You're welcome.